Hi everyone, and welcome back to Vanished Memories, a channel dedicated to getting out lesser-known true crime and missing persons cases. My name is Brianna, and today I will be presenting to you the intertwined cases of Teressa McCoy and Austin Gamez. This case occurred on December 26th of 2017, and it would result in the death of Teressa McCoy and the disappearance of Austin Gamez. If you are interested in this type of content, please subscribe to my channel as I put out videos like this every Wednesday. Now, before I get into their cases, I do just want to discuss a brief trigger warning or content warning. Today, I will be discussing the topic of gun violence as well as the topic of drugs. Viewer discretion is, of course, advised. As I mentioned, this case involves two individuals, and this case would take place in Louisville, Kentucky on December 26th of 2017. The victims involved in this case, Teressa and Austin, had actually been friends most of their lives, as their mothers had actually known each other in middle school and were pregnant with them at the same time. And due to this fact, they actually were pretty good friends at the time, even though it was completely platonic. But before we get into what happened on that day in December of 2017, I want to get a little bit into the background of both of them, and I will be starting with Teressa. Teressa was born to her parents, Avery and Angie, on August 31st of 1990. From what I can tell, Teressa was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and likely had spent a good portion of her life there. But at the time of the case, Teressa actually resided in DePauw, Indiana, from what I could tell, and she was in the Louisville, Kentucky area in order to look at houses that day. At some point in Teressa's life, she would go on to get married and have 2 children. And at the time of this case, her older child was 8 years old, and her younger child was 6 years old. Teressa was known to be a great, hardworking mom who did anything to provide for her kids. And her mother, Angie, would be quoted as saying about her daughter, "Her heart was bigger than eternity, and her universe was her family and her job." Now, let's get into a little bit of detail about Austin. Austin was born on September 26th of 1990, about a month after Teressa. Austin's mother's name is Amy, though I wasn't able to determine his father's name. Austin had 2 children at the time that this case took place, and according to all sources, he seemed to be a very good father who really enjoyed taking care of and spending time with his children. Now, as a result of this case, Austin has never been found, but it was said that he would never willingly leave his children. Now that we know just a little bit about Austin and Teressa, let's get into the day that Austin and Teressa would unfortunately go missing and be killed. That would be December 26th of 2017. So on the day of December 26th, Austin would be at a friend's house, just hanging and chatting with them, and at around 4 p.m. he would receive a call. It's never been fully confirmed as to who called Austin that day, but what we do know is that he had previously agreed to look at a house with Teressa that day, and he would end up picking her up between 4 and 7 p.m. that night. So it's assumed that Teressa was the one who had called him in order to come get her. So Austin would go pick up Teressa in a rented Yukon black SUV in order to go look at that house. But on his way, he decided to make a pit stop to his friend Larry Sauer's house. From what I could tell, though it's not been fully confirmed, allegedly Austin was going to Larry's house in order to purchase some pills from him. We're not sure exactly what time this happened, but from a few different sources, I was able to figure out the last time that Amy, Austin's mother, heard from him was at around 5:02 p.m. that day, so we can assume that he likely might have gotten to the house around that time, and the events that happened unfolded right after that. However, after making the stop at Larry's house, Austin and Teressa would not be heard from again. This was, of course, completely uncharacteristic of them, 2 people who really valued making time for their family and specifically their children. Early the next morning, on December 27th, the manager of a local salvage yard called Bessler's Auto, Steve Morris, would discover Austin's rented Yukon in the parking lot. Now, from what I can tell, Austin and Teressa had not been reported as missing yet, so it seems no one was actively looking for the vehicle, but Steve would immediately realize that this car was out of place. He would say that a lot of the vehicles that were dropped into the salvage yard were old, so the Yukon being there was very out of place since it was a brand new vehicle. So Steve would decide to take it upon himself to go towards the vehicle and see why it might have been left there. And when he did so, he discovered a woman who we would later find out is Teressa, and she was unfortunately slumped over in the passenger seat with her seatbelt on. Steve would knock on the window in order to get her attention, but he soon realized that it didn't look as though she was breathing, so he would decide to call 911 in order to get some help for her. At the time, it seems as though Steve had reported this as an overdose, likely not seeing the blood and the bullet wound on her. However, when police and paramedics responded, they would realize that unfortunately Teressa was already deceased and would not be able to be revived. And eventually they would come to realize that she had not died as a result of an overdose, but as a result of a gunshot wound. As I mentioned, police would eventually discover that this woman in the passenger seat was Teressa McCoy, a 27-year-old mother of two, whose life was taken way too soon. In the investigation immediately following this discovery, police would realize that the vehicle was rented in Austin's name. However, he was nowhere to be found and no one was able to reach him. And unfortunately, since then, all efforts to reach Austin have been fruitless. After this case, investigators would realize that there was foul play involved, and so would launch an investigation. They would eventually obtain surveillance video of the salvage yard, and they were able to determine that the vehicle had been dropped off on the night of December 26, 2017, at around 7 p.m. However, the video was too dark to be able to determine who had dropped the vehicle off. As I mentioned, Austin had been reported missing after this, and unfortunately he has never been seen or heard from again. But searches would begin to start for Austin, though unfortunately over the past few years he has still not been found. I also was able to find that Austin's friends and family had coordinated a lot of searches of their own, and at one point in early 2018, his family had actually offered a $5,000 reward for any information that could lead to his whereabouts. However, unfortunately, as we know, he still remains missing to this day. While searches were going on, it seems as though police did start to launch an investigation as to who could have caused the death of Teressa and the disappearance of Austin. And eventually, they would end up being led to two individuals. In 2018, police would search the homes of Thomas Lanham and Larry Sauer in connection with the cases. If you remember, Larry Sauer was actually the friend that Austin had visited with Teressa in the car, and Thomas Lanham was the next-door neighbor of Larry. As a result of the searches done on the men's home, Thomas would actually be arrested on drug charges, though those charges would be dropped very shortly after. At the time, no charges were levied against the men regarding their involvement with Teressa's death and Austin's disappearance. However, shortly after, that would change. Larry would eventually be arrested, and on December 14th of 2019, he would be charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of tampering with evidence. Shortly after, Thomas would also be charged, and his charges would consist of 2 counts of complicity to murder and complicity to tampering with evidence. Complicity in this sense means that while Thomas was not directly involved with the killing or disappearance of Teressa and Austin, he would have been compliant in that, and possibly had played a role in that. From what I could gather, the arrests were made with evidence garnered from search warrants, witness statements, video recordings, and phone records. One of the alleged pieces of evidence was actually a bloodstain that was found in Thomas's car, and according to sources, that blood had a 99.9% match leading back to Austin. With these charges, we're able to see that police believe that Austin was also killed. According to police, they believe that Austin and Teressa were killed, but unfortunately Austin's body has never been found and was likely disposed of in a different area. So the family would be notified of the arrests in this case, and they would be glad to receive justice, or at least what they thought would be justice. But unfortunately, cracks would start to emerge within the cases against the men, and soon all charges would eventually be dropped against them. When Thomas was arrested, the judge had actually set his bail for $500,000, so $500,000. And according to sources, no one believed that he would be able to make this payment. But in early 2020, he would be bonded out. According to a news article that looked back into who had bonded out Thomas, it was actually determined that his bond was posted by 6 different individuals, one of which included his mother, Laura. Now, Laura actually had listed her occupation as a self-employed house cleaner. However, she posted almost half of his bond, so about $250,000. This was actually the largest bail in recent history in that county to have been posted, and it didn't really add up for a lot of people. how anyone, especially Thomas's mother Laura, who worked as a house cleaner, was able to afford the bail. But we would find out years later, about 2 years ago in 2024, that this money actually was a result of a very large money laundering scheme born out of drug trafficking. Shortly after the bail was posted, Thomas's charges were actually dropped. Prosecutors would actually drop these charges, stating that the evidence that they thought they had found in Thomas's vehicle that was a match to Austin's blood and his DNA actually was not read correctly. And according to them, the DNA did not belong to Austin and was not a 99.99% match. But I do think that this is very strange considering the fact that the original DNA results concluded that it was such a close match to Austin, which we will get into in a little bit. Now, even though Thomas's charges were dropped, Larry's charges were still upheld. However, soon after, Larry's charges would change as well. In February of 2020, so a month after Thomas's charges were dropped, Larry's charges were altered. So instead of Larry being charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of tampering with evidence, his charges would change to 2 counts of complicity to murder and 1 count of tampering with evidence. Now, this is of course very confusing because his charge was changed to complicity to murder, which implies that someone else had murdered the two. However, we don't have answers as to who they think that is. And unfortunately, Larry's charges would actually eventually be fully dropped, so he did not have any charges levied against him. I could not find the exact day that these charges were dropped or why, but it seems as though it likely could have been the same reason for Thomas's, the lack of evidence or the misread of evidence. Amy, Austin's mother, actually believes in this case that the prosecutor was paid off by the Lanhams, so Thomas's family. And as we know now, the Lanhams were involved in a very large, very profitable money laundering ring. So it is believable for them to have that amount of money, unfortunately. I actually found this theory from Amy on the comments of a Reddit post about her son Austin and his disappearance, but I have since spoken with Amy, and she mentioned that it is okay for me to mention this next part. So Amy had actually decided to speak with the prosecutor on this case, and the prosecutor would tell her the Lanhams are like the Mexican cartel. And after that, Amy would ask him how much she had gotten paid, but the prosecutor would no longer look her in the eye. Now, this is of course concerning, but what's even more concerning is the fact that Amy actually said that she was aware of the fact that Thomas and Larry both had family who had worked within the LMPD, the investigating agency dealing with their children's cases. Amy does believe that it's possible that DNA results could have been changed in order to relieve the men of their charges. And unfortunately, even if we do want to believe in our justice system and the people who are supposed to protect us, it is possible for corruption like this to happen, and so I think that a theory like this could have some truth to it. It is definitely very strange for a prosecutor to have enough evidence to charge these men with between 3 and 4 counts each, but then all of a sudden all that evidence to disappear. And with the prosecutor being unable to even look at Amy after she had confronted him about this, I do unfortunately think that this is a very viable option. Since the charges have been dropped, unfortunately really nothing has happened in the way of justice for Teressa and Austin. I actually found that in 2023, the police department dug up the backyard of one of the cases connected with this house, but unfortunately I've seen no updates since, so I don't think there was any other evidence garnered from that excavation. So now that we've discussed the death of Teressa McCoy and the disappearance of Austin Gamez, let's get into the theories that surround their cases, starting with the least believed theory and going into the most believed theory. So theory number 1 revolves around drug involvement. So Austin had been previously accused of money laundering at a local casino near to him and had been apparently charged and arrested with these charges, but from what I can tell, he never served time for it. Some people believe that due to these charges and the fact that there was drug involvement somehow attached to these money laundering charges, that this could have been a catalyst for Austin's disappearance and Teressa's death. However, I think that this theory is kind of far-fetched, and that's for a few reasons. The first one is the fact that Austin had these charges back in 2014, so that would be almost 4 years before he went missing and Teressa was killed. Also, Amy herself believes that this was not a contributing factor to her son Austin's disappearance and Teressa's murder. And I feel that it often speaks volumes when someone so close to the case is able to refute a theory. And like I mentioned before, there really doesn't seem to be much evidence in the way of this, so I don't think that this theory really makes sense, but I did just want to mention it. So theory number 2 is that the crimes that occurred in this case were perpetrated by someone else. Some people do believe that Thomas and Larry are fully innocent, as the law says that they are, but I really don't fully believe that someone else could have been involved in this case. I think if someone else was responsible for this case, we would have gotten some public acknowledgement of that. Also, I don't know why the cops, even 3 years after the men's charges were dismissed, would decide to dig up the backyard of one of the houses that the men resided at. So again, this theory doesn't really seem that solid to me. The last theory does though, and the last theory is that they had the right people, but the wrong evidence or corruption of the evidence. So it seems to be most widely believed that Larry and Thomas were allegedly involved in what happened to Teressa and Austin. But as the theory goes, there was not enough evidence to convict Thomas and Larry, or as we kind of can believe, there was corruption involved in the case that caused these charges to be dropped. Again, I can't say for sure that this theory is accurate, and all of the things that I'm saying about the men are alleged right now, but I do think that this theory holds the most ground. Again, it was known that Austin was stopping by Larry's house that day, so it is pretty suspicious that what happened to him and Teressa happened shortly after he would have been at his house. Additionally, as I mentioned before, there was some blood evidence at one point, but according to police, that evidence was incorrectly interpreted. Unfortunately, I think that it is entirely possible for something to have happened inside the house when Austin went to pick up these alleged pills that he went to get, and as a result of that altercation that resulted in Teressa's death and Austin's disappearance or presumed death. I also do want to note here that Amy does believe that what happened to her son and presumably Teressa that day actually was planned and organized in some way. I do think that there is some ground to Amy's theory that this was a setup, considering that Larry would have known, of course, that Austin was coming and could have done something to him and set that up prior to Austin's arrival. As a result, Austin may have been killed and his body just not found, and after that, unfortunately, Larry and possibly an accomplice who could have been Thomas decided to kill Teressa in order to prevent her from being a witness and disclosing what had happened to Austin. So, as you may be able to tell from how I presented this case and the charges that were levied against the two men earlier in this case, it does seem as though the most prominent theory is that Austin is also deceased, just like Teressa, but his body was not found. From what I can tell, his mother Amy also believes that he is unfortunately deceased at this point. But in any missing persons case, I like to put their description up, just on the slim chance that they could be found. Austin's description is the following. Austin is white and Hispanic. He is between 5'11 and 6'1, and at the time he weighed between approximately 170 and 185 pounds. He had blue eyes, brown hair, and at the time, his facial hair was described as being scruffy along his jawline and chin. Austin also has a small scar near his temple/eyebrow, and he has the following tattoos. A rosary on his chest, a tattoo of writing on a scroll on the inside of his right forearm, and multiple tattoos on his left arm, which includes the letters MOB, or the word mob, 2 stacks of money, and skull faces in flames. Austin was last known to be wearing the following items of clothing: a black North Face jacket or pullover, black size 34 True Religion jeans, and size 10.5 shoes in an unknown color and brand. He was also carrying a designer brown wallet and had a designer buckle on his belt, which was either Louis Vuitton or Gucci. If you or anyone you know have any information regarding Austin's disappearance and Teressa's murder, please reach out to the proper authorities. I have the information for the agency handling their cases on screen now, as well as in the description box below, as always. Also, I do just want to mention that in order to do this video, I actually have been in contact with Amy, Austin's mom, as well as Angie, Teressa's mom, so I just want to thank them again for allowing me to cover their children's cases. And I do hope that they and their family can get justice and answers for what happened to Austin and Teressa on that day. With that being said, this concludes the disappearance of Austin Gamez and the death of Teressa McCoy, which occurred in Louisville, Texas on December 26th of 2017. Thank you for taking the time to tune in and listen to Austin and Teressa's stories. If you enjoyed learning about these cases or found this educational at all, please don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, or share this video. And again, my name is Brianna, and thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Vanished